April 12, 1945. A muddy road outside a small U.S. military camp in western Germany. The rain had just stopped, leaving puddles that reflected gray skies and the distant ruins of a war-torn town. Down the road trudged a group of German children, no older than 8 or 9. Their shoes were worn thin, their clothes threadbare, some patched with scraps of fabric. Some carried small suitcases, others clutched tattered dolls. Their eyes were wide, but not with curiosity. They were filled with a quiet, brutal fear. They had been told stories of American cruelty, the sort that made a child's imagination run wild with dread. Some imagined whips, others imagined harsh words, or even chains. They expected punishment for crimes they hadn't committed, blame for a war they barely understood. But the soldiers waiting for them were not what they expected. The officers, wearing crisp uniforms and press coats, stood beside piles of blankets and crates of rations. Their faces were calm, and their voices, though firm, carried an unusual warmth. One officer knelt to tie the laces of a boy's shoes, muttering a joke about the long march he'd made just to meet the children. It was a small irony, and perhaps too subtle for children, but it was the first hint that this encounter would not follow the rules the children had learned to expect. The U.S. Army had been handling displaced persons for months, but children were always a special concern. By April 1945, over 3,000 German children had passed through camps under American supervision, many orphaned, some separated from families, all carrying the weight of loss. In contrast to the chaos outside the camp, the soldiers had prepared a clean, organized space. Rows of bunks, tables with steaming bowls of soup, and baskets of bread waited. Hans, a 9-year-old with a shock of blonde hair matted to his forehead, froze at the threshold. He had expected a room of shouting, maybe a guard with a stick, and certainly punishment for something as minor as dropping his suitcase. Instead, the smell of bread and soup filled the air. Gretel, a smaller girl with wide brown eyes, whispered to Hans, "Do you think they'll hit us?" The answer came silently, in the officer's smile as he gestured to a bowl of hot soup. "Eat first. We'll talk later." The contrast was jarring. They had walked through ruined towns and rubble, through towns where hunger had become a constant companion. And now here was warmth. Here was food. Here was kindness, simple, tangible, almost absurdly plentiful. Historical records show that the U.S. Army, alongside the Red Cross, had begun systematic efforts to care for displaced children in early 1945. Letters from officers described the disbelief on children's faces when offered chocolate, clean clothes, or a bath. "At first they looked at us as if we were monsters," wrote Lieutenant Robert Kennedy, stationed near Trier, "until the bread warmed their hands and slowly their hearts." There was humor, too, though understated. One boy, determined to keep some control over his new surroundings, attempted to march in step with an officer. He tripped over his own oversized coat, landing face first in the mud. The officer laughed softly, helping him up, and whispered, "First lesson, you can't fight mud." It was a small, human moment that punctured fear with relief, a reminder that life could be gentle even when it had been cruel. By the afternoon, children who had entered the camp pale, anxious and withdrawn, were sitting at tables, dipping bread into soup. For some, it was the first hot meal in days. For others, the first meal at all in months. There was no scolding for spilling or for taking too long. Only encouragement. only the surprising reality that these American officers, once imagined as agents of punishment, were caretakers. But even as the children began to relax, a quiet tension lingered. They could not yet fully trust this new reality. Fear was not easily shed. And in the back of every child's mind, the question remained, would this kindness last, or was it simply the calm before another storm? This was the beginning of an unexpected chapter, one where expectation collided with reality in the starkest, most human way possible. They had expected cruelty, and what they received was care. They had anticipated punishment, and what came first was patience, warmth, and a kind of love that they had not imagined could exist in the middle of war. And yet, as officers moved among the children, helping them settle into beds and organizing games in the yard, one could sense that this was only the first shock. Something even more extraordinary awaited. Something that would redefine not only the children's understanding of humanity, but the officers' understanding of themselves. But what came next shocked them even more. The following weeks unfolded like something out of a story the children had never dared imagine. The same officers who had greeted them at the gate, once figures of fear in their minds, now became guardians, teachers, and occasionally playful conspirators. Sunlight streamed through the barracks windows, casting long golden stripes across the wooden floors. Children who had arrived pale, trembling, and wary now ran along the hallways, their laughter echoing against walls that had once only heard the clatter of boots and the orders of soldiers. Tiny feet pattered in uneven rhythms, some slipping on the polished wood, others balancing oversized jackets that hung from their shoulders like tents. The transformation was startling, almost surreal. Officers had begun the formal process of care, documenting the children's identities, arranging meals, and coordinating with the Red Cross for long-term placements. Many children, orphaned or separated from family, were eligible for adoption by American families. Some would remain in Europe, placed with foster families near liberated towns, while others would cross the Atlantic to start entirely new lives. Hans, the boy who had tripped over his coat, now had a regular bed, a small chest for his belongings, and a uniform slightly too large, pressed for inspection. Gretel, the quiet girl with wide eyes, discovered the joy of toys, blocks, dolls, and simple puzzles that seemed like magic after months of survival. Their expectations of cruelty had been replaced by astonishment, and slowly by trust. Statistics from U.S. Army records illustrate the scale of this humanitarian effort. By June 1945, nearly 5,000 German children were under U.S. military care across Western Europe. Officers reported that most of these children had never experienced regular meals, clean clothing, or even the simple stability of a fixed bedtime. Here, suddenly, all of those needs were met. Historical testimonies capture these moments vividly. Lieutenant William Turner, stationed near the Rhine, wrote, "Several children clung to my uniform like it was their last hope. They stayed, and they thrived. Watching them laugh, for the first time in months, was more moving than any parade or ceremony I had ever attended." There were small ironies, too. Officers hardened by war found themselves negotiating bedtime routines as if they were strategic operations. One noted with a wry smile, convincing a group of 7-year-olds to brush their teeth was harder than any battle I've ever fought. And yet, it was these Ordinary, human challenges that bridged the gap between military discipline and parental care. Personal testimonies from children, recorded later, illustrate the depth of this transformation. One child recalled, "I didn't know what love was until they called me by my name and smiled." Another wrote decades later about the first bath in a hot tub, the smell of soap, the warmth of water, the shock of cleanliness after months of filth. These seemingly mundane experiences were miracles to children whose lives had been defined by fear and scarcity. Adoption brought its own set of adjustments. Some children were placed with American families, learning new languages, customs, and traditions. Letters from these early adoptees often reflect a mix of longing for a homeland left behind and gratitude for the lives they had been given. They learned that home could be defined not by place alone, but by the people who cared for them. The ideological and emotional transformation was mutual. Children learned to trust, to hope, to play again without fear. Officers, too, were changed, discovering that their role as soldiers could extend beyond combat to encompass compassion, patience, and mentorship. "We thought we were helping them survive," one officer reflected. "But in truth, they saved our hearts from a war." Contrast remained a recurring motif. Children who had expected punishment now played freely. Officers who had been trained to command were coaxing giggles and guiding small hands to wash and dress. The harsh geometry of military life gave way to the unpredictable, tender chaos of childhood. By the summer of 1945, the camp had become a place of transformation. Walls that had once contained fear now echoed with joy. The children's laughter, tentative at first, grew stronger every day. The officers had not just fed them or clothed them. They had offered a vision of a world that could exist after the war, a world where kindness, patience, and family could still flourish. Captured, fearful, hungry, they arrived expecting cruelty. And in the hands of those they called enemies, they found family. And as the children looked back on the lives they had left behind and forward to the uncertain futures that awaited them, one truth had crystallized. The expectation of punishment had been replaced by the reality of care, and a generation scarred by war had glimpsed, finally, the extraordinary power of human compassion.